the synapse. You should understand, I have here one neuron, I have here another neuron, and an impulse is being transmitted from the one to the other. But in actual fact, the neurons don't really physically touch one another. We can see here where one neuron is making, the end of one neuron is making contact with the cell body of the next neuron. There is no actual physical contact between the two neurons. It means there is a tiny space here, a small space somewhere there between the two neurons. There is a small space. And that small space is what we call the synapse. So a synapse is the point where impulses pass from the terminal branch of an axon. My impulse will pass from there and jump into here of an axon of one neuron to the dendrite of the next neuron. And that gap between the two neurons is what we call the synaptic gap, otherwise a synapse. Okay. Now, there is one aspect about an impulse that we need to discuss at this point. From the definition of an impulse, we'll realize that an impulse is an electro. An impulse is an electrochemical. It's an electrochemical message. It means that an impulse has an electric component. Impulse has an electric component and a chemical component. So let's see what happens. When the impulse is traveling, while it is inside the axon or within the neuron itself, it is present in the form of electricity. And we discussed that when we were talking about the myelin sheath being an insulator and keeping all of that electricity inside within the axon. But then, when the same message is then passed from one neuron to another, electricity cannot jump through space. Earlier we saw that there is a space between the two neurons because they don't make physical contact. Okay, so when the impulse is traveling from one neuron to another, because electricity cannot jump through that space, a chemical, a neurotransmitter such as acetylcholine, dopamine, and serotonin is then used to pass through and stimulate the next neuron. That's what we have here. Our synapse, we have it here. And since these neurotransmitters are used at the level of the synapse to convey the impulse, neurotransmitters are chemicals. That's why we say an impulse is an electrochemical message. The electric component is found within the neuron, and the chemical component of that same message is between the neurons in the synaptic cleft, where we have chemicals being used. Okay. Now, how does it function? What happens then with the synapse? We shall see in our next slide. But notice here, we have vesicles, and these vesicles contain chemicals, and these chemicals at one point will have to be poured out of the vesicles and into this space here. We have our impulse that will be traveling in that direction. That's our impulse coming in, that was coming in that direction, and it will reach at the end of the axon here, the terminal of axon, or the terminal branches or the terminal dendrites of the axon will reach there, and chemicals will be poured out. So here, remember that an impulse is an electrochemical message, and remember why we call it that way. So this is our diagram represented in a different way. I have here the axon of the first neuron, that's the terminal axon of the first neuron, and I have here the dendrite of the next neuron. This is the dendrite of the next neuron on this side here. And I have the terminal axon of the first neuron on this side. Okay. And here, I have here in the space here is my synapse. That's a synaptic space. And I have the vesicles here. There's quite a number of them. So those are the vesicles. I have the vesicles there. And here, these are the neurotransmitters, the chemicals. The little circles here are the neurotransmitters, the chemicals. So, what happens? Imagine electricity traveling at full speed, very fast, in the form of the impulse traveling in the form of electricity at full speed from one neuron, and it wants to go to the next neuron. We're now traveling here from left to right. It has to come here. But like I said earlier, this electricity can't jump through the space. Okay, that's not possible like that. It can't jump through that space. So what then should happen? Because in the meantime, the next neuron needs to receive that information that's found here. It needs to receive the same impulse here. But how does it occur? Imagine this electricity traveling from left to right, okay, at full speed. And that is the end of, this is like the end here of this terminal axon. And my electricity is coming. What will happen? As it's coming with full speed, it will then hit there. Okay, and it bangs there. What does it do? It hits on these vesicles and causes them. When it hits on the vesicles, what happens to the vesicles? They splash out. They splash out the chemical. Okay, they spill them out like. Okay. Now, when the chemicals are spilled out, they will then travel through the synaptic cleft. They are traveling through the synaptic cleft. And I want you to notice that on the other side of the other neuron, the dendrites, they have receptors. Receptors with binding sites, where these chemicals, you see here with binding sites here, where the chemicals can fit. They have these receptors where these chemicals, the molecules, will come and bind. The moment these molecules bind on those receptors, I want you to think as if it's a cold winter day, you've taken out your shirt, you're probably relaxing, but it's extremely cold even around you, and somehow your enemy comes and pours cold water on your back. What will happen? You will vibrate, okay? You will shake. So that's the same thing that happens here. As the neurotransmitters are traveling, the moment they bind to these receptors, the next neuron shakes. And when it picks up, it shakes, it gets stimulated. When it gets stimulated, impulse is fired in the form of electricity. The moment it gets stimulated, it fires up that electricity again. That's how it fires. So in that way, I want you to realize something here. While that was happening, I want you to realize something. In the meantime, the moment that it received the neurotransmitters, in the meantime, what did it fire? It fired electricity. Do you see how we have moved the electricity from this side to this side? And the electricity will now continue inside that neuron and go to the next neuron. At the terminal dendrite, chemicals again will be poured out to the synaptic cleft, and it will stimulate again the next neuron, and again it will continue in a continuous manner till it reaches its destination. Okay, so that's how impulses are able to jump through the synaptic cleft, the synaptic space, and to the next neuron, thanks to these neurotransmitters and this mechanism that is set up here. There is a catch though. You will realize that when an impulse reaches the synaptic cleft, okay, when it happens like that, the neurotransmitters are released, yes, but are released in large quantities, which is not very much necessary. Okay, the moment few of them bind here, that is quite enough to generate the electrical impulse so that it can continue. The remaining chemicals, if they come also and bind, later on bind, it means for one same stimulus, just one stimulus, you will feel multiple pains, and for a prolonged period of time, and that is not necessary. So to avoid that, what will happen? Enzymes again will be produced so that they can then digest or break down the excess chemicals that are found here, so that you don't repetitively feel the pain. Okay, one is enough. One impulse, one stimulus. One stimulus, one impulse, so that you don't feel the pain continuously. So that's what happens. This summarizes what happens at the level of the synapse. So, what then is the importance of a synapse, or the significance of a synapse? First, it ensures that impulses will only travel in one direction, and this is made possible by the fact that at the level of a synapse, we have one end where we have the receptors, like we saw earlier in one neuron, and at one end we have vesicles, chemicals that are going to be released, and these chemicals are released such that they travel to the receptor. It will never happen in the same synapse in opposite direction. Why? Because receptors, the part with receptors doesn't have vesicles, so that it can then start releasing chemicals to the other side. All receptors will not release chemicals. So it happens only in one direction, so that impulses will travel only in one direction. At the level of a synapse, nerve impulses can be speeded up or slowed down or totally blocked, okay, so that we don't receive any unnecessary or unimportant, we'll call them background stimuli, okay. They will be filtered out, so that we don't keep on feeling things here and there and all the time. Otherwise your body will be operating like a vibrator. It keeps feeling things left and right and all the time, and you'll feel at one point like you're dealing with spirits. Okay. Again, the synapses, when they work together, they channel impulses such that the reactions are integrated. All these reactions are brought up to become as one and become part of learning and memory, so that when you react to one impulse, you get experience, and you know how to ward it off, or you know how to be to stay away from that sort of stimulus in future. Okay, so that's the importance of the synapse.